At this point, I think the Boldr Odyssey is an aptly named watch, as it's been on quite a journey over the last few years. It was one of the first few watches that Boldr put out. I think that was about 3 years ago. The first iteration was a tough 500-meter diver, which was defined by a chunky but highly angular case, and that was mixed with a rather minimal and nautical-themed bezel. While it's not the first watch that Boldr ever put out, I think it's one of the ones that helped define their unique style, which has now transcended into their entire collection. And the Boldr Odyssey has then persisted in one form or another since it was first released. A year after the original one was introduced, they followed it up with a bronze version that kept the same style. But a year after that, they went back to steel but added a California-style dial. And late last year, they introduced 3 new bronze models, but they're a bit different than those previous iterations, as they come with a matte textured dial and a more defined bezel with an insert, and I think this really changes up the look a bit. First, you have the very limited edition White Knight, which is then followed up by the Blue Aventurine. And then you have this one, the Serpentine, which is named after the green textured rock formation. Now, Boldr contacted me in late February and wanted to know if I was interested in reviewing the Odyssey. And as I was, they were kind enough to gift this watch to the channel. So a huge thank you to Boldr. But I do need to issue a little bit of an apology, as I did plan on having this review out a while ago. But as we all know, the world kind of went a little bit crazy, and my plans, as well as everyone else's, kind of got jumbled up a bit. But regardless, we're here now, so let's take a closer look. At 45.5 millimeters wide, the Bronze Odyssey is a watch that's really hard not to notice. And that's 45.5 without the crown. It's more like 50 width. The overall finishing of the Odyssey is good. It just has a nice smooth brush finish throughout the entire watch, which is made even more apparent by the developing of the dull patina on the bronze. You also have a lug-to-lug of 52.5 and a total thickness of 16.5. So without a doubt, this is a larger watch, yet it's also a watch that just oozes presence. It's also a little more comfortable to wear than it might sound. The case is very geometric, just defined by a multitude of angles. And to me, this is very representative of Boldr's style. The lugs come down and away from the case, and in the process they create a very small cradle for the slightly recessed caseback. So even though the Odyssey has a longer lug-to-lug, I found that it was already starting to conform to the natural curvature of my wrist, and it never really felt like it was overhanging. Yet if there is an issue, it's all with the weight of the watch, as it is a bit heavy, as you're talking 173 grams with its leather strap. And that's more than some normal watches are with a steel bracelet. So it's definitely a weight you can feel throughout the day, and unless you have your strap fairly tight, it does start to feel a bit top-heavy, and starts to flop around just a little bit. But I do want to stress that this doesn't just feel heavy, but feels pretty solid and well made. It's just built like a tank that was milled out of a solid block of marine-grade bronze. So it's not surprising to see 500 meters of water resistance here. And with that, I think it's safe to say that the designers approached the Odyssey with just a sense of overkill in mind, at least for most aspects of the watch. Before we go any further, we should stop and talk about the movement, as it's my biggest concern when it comes to the Odyssey. And looking into some older reviews, I think it's shared among a few other reviewers as well. It's a Seiko NH35A, and that's one of the best workhorse automatic movements out there. 40-ish hour power reserve, hacking, and hand winding. Basically, it's a fantastic choice on any entry-level watch. But here we are talking about a watch with an MSRP of $649. So it's not exactly entry level. First off, there's absolutely nothing wrong with a Seiko NH35A. It's just that when you look at other watches in this price range, you're going to find them with higher beat movements, mostly from Etta and Sellita, with a handful of watches that have a Miyota 9015. Although Boldr is not alone here, and there are a handful of other companies with similar movements in this price range. And one great example is the new Seiko King Turtles. So there isn't necessarily anything wrong with that. It's just that for me personally, I think it's a little outside my comfort zone to see a watch in this price with one of those movements. and I think it does hurt the value a bit, so that's just something to think about here. However, I do need to compliment Boldr on the accuracy of this particular watch. I'm not sure how extensive they're fine-tuning the regulation before shipping them out, but this one was only losing 2 seconds a day, and that is absolutely nothing to complain about. So rounding out the specs, you have a 22mm lug width, double dome sapphire crystal with AR, a signed screw-down crown, and a helium escape valve. Now, some people do think a helium escape valve is a bit unnecessary, as realistically most people won't ever need it. Just as realistically, most people don't need 500 meters of water resistance. I mean, if you ever find yourself near that deep, let's be honest, you ain't coming back up. However, personally, I do think it's appropriate to have on a premium 500-meter diver. It's just that in this case, that silver steel of the valve looks a little bit out of place on the bronze. Now, moving to the rear, you have a stainless screw-down case back with just a really cool embossed design, which is a design that really emphasizes the name Odyssey, and I think it illustrates that Boldr really does think of this as a watch that's primed for exploration. And this caseback is just a really cool touch, and it's something I really do like. At the right, nestled in between a couple of crown guards, you do have a bit of an oversized signed screw-down crown. It doesn't stick out very far, but it is a bit wide. Normally I'd say a crown of this size would be a bit too much, but here I think it blends in nicely with that angular design. Not to mention, it is a bit easy to get a hold of and manipulate with that size. The bezel design here is a little different than the previous Odysseys. It's still the same layout, but here some of the indicators are marked, and there is a green aluminum insert to match the dial. For the price, I think a ceramic insert would have been nice, but I don't think your typical glossy ceramic insert would really give this the same vintage aesthetic, or look near as good sitting next to the bronze case. Now, the action of the bezel is great. It's 120 click and unidirectional as you'd expect, with almost no backplay. And I have to say that I really do like the lume pip at the top. Whenever it gets a full charge, it always has a nice glow to it, which I think looks great next to the green and the bronze. Now, before we get to the dial, let's quickly talk about the text sitting on the ledge above it. And this text is obviously a reference to the Rolex Sea Dweller, which is really something I'd expect an homage. Yet here, there really isn't anything other than that text, which reminds me of a Rolex. I think it's a pretty original design, so I think the text here is a little unnecessary. Yet the ledge itself I do like. Even though it has a brushed texture, it's just slightly more reflective than the dial and the patinated bronze, which I think creates a nice frame for the dial below it. The dial itself is a matte textured emerald green, and that's where the Serpentine name originates from. I've seen a lot of other textured watches in the past, and they always run the risk of winding up looking a little cheap and plastic looking. Yet here, I think Boldr did it right. The applied indices look fantastic sitting on that textured green dial, where the old radium lume is thinly framed with rose gold, which you could say the same about the hands, and I think all of it looks brilliant in macro. And I especially like the contrast and light that is created by that polished framing, as opposed to the duller tones of the patinated case and the green textured dial. The broader hands especially always seem to catch that light and act as a focus drawing your eyes in. Just beyond the indices, you have a thin painted chapter ring in white, and that matches the Boldr logo at the top, as well as a small but noticeable wall of text at the bottom. Normally, I'm not a fan of 3 lines of text, but here that font is so small and minuscule it just sort of blends into the backdrop. As does the date at the 6, which in large part is due to the green date wheel. It's always a nice when a custom date wheel is made to match the dial. Although I do think the text on that date wheel is a little small, at least proportionally to the rest of the larger case and dial. Overall, everything looks pretty well executed, except for one small issue I did find. And that's with the 2 bars that make up the 12 indicator at the top. The gap between them is narrower at the top than it is at the bottom, so I think one of them is slightly off. Now, it is a minor thing, but it is pretty obvious once you notice it, and at this price range, the details really do matter. But other than that, I think everything here is pretty well done. When they offered to send the Odyssey, I really wasn't sure what to expect. But this was a watch that the more time I got to spend with it, the more time I got to appreciate it. The overall dial layout and a green and gold color scheme, as well as a bronze patinated case, these are all elements I've seen before in some combination or another. Yet here, there's just something about the way that Boldr combined them that kind of created an experience like none other. The Serpentine's color scheme is a bit of a bold choice, and it's not going to be for everyone. But overall, I think Boldr has enough other colorways of the Odyssey that I do think they have their bases covered. But let's move on to the lume, and with its size, I thought the Odyssey was going to be pretty good. So I sort of arranged a 4-hour contest of champions with some of the best watches I have. As you can see, the Odyssey initially looks great, and I really do like how those broader hands look here. But as you watch, you do see that it goes out about the same time as the turtle, and maybe right before the swordfish, which then leaves the abyss and the Great Wall to go on for another 2 hours before they also fade out. So overall, I think the Odyssey has good lume, and it's something that should last you through the night, but it's not crazy good like some others. And that leaves us with the strap to talk about, and this is a strap that really impressed me. It's a nice green Horween leather strap with white stitching, and it does have an accompanying signed bronze buckle. So the patina there should develop and match the case over time. While the strap is pretty thick, it's not overly stiff and surprisingly flexible. Horween leather is always great, and this is no exception, and it's always nice to have it in a color that matches the dial. The only issue I had with the strap is that I thought the holes were just a little bit small. So the first few times you put it on and take it off might be a little bit more difficult till it breaks in. The only other thing I want to point out is that this is a leather strap on a diver, which personally I think looks really good, but it's not exactly ready to get in the water. So if you are planning on getting this one wet, you will need a second, more water-worthy strap to go with it. When it's all said and done, my only real complaint here is the movement. Now, I'd love it if this had at least a Miyota 9015, but we have a Seiko NH35A, and that's just how it is right now. So as I said, that's just something to bear in mind when you're comparing this to other watches in this price range. But other than that, this is a great watch, and a good choice for someone that's looking for something a little bit larger, with a huge presence that's still a bit comfortable. And I think the images here really speak for themselves. This was just an easy watch to capture, and that patinaed bronze case mixes with that textured green dial just to give this a really cool, unique look. But let me know what you think about the Boldr Odyssey Serpentine, or if you think there are any other Boldrs I should take a look at. I've always been interested in the expeditions, but haven't yet had the chance. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for joining me.